The sun cast long shadows across the parched Arizona landscape as Abigail Turner stumbled along the dusty trail, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly, the other clutching a small bundle of belongings. At 19, she found herself alone, banished from the only home she'd ever known, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her, a life that had become her sentence of exile. Newton, Arizona Territory, 1882, was not kind to unwed mothers. When Abigail's condition became impossible to hide, the town council, led by her own father, had given her until sundown to leave. Their words still rang in her ears. "We'll not have such moral corruption in our God-fearing community." The summer heat beat down mercilessly as she trudged forward, her throat parched, legs trembling with exhaustion. 3 days she'd been walking, sleeping under the stars, rationing the meager food she'd managed to grab before being forced out. The baby kicked, as if protesting their desperate circumstances, and Abigail winced. "Just a bit longer, little one," she whispered, though she had no idea where they were headed or how they would survive. As the sun began to set, turning the sky a brilliant orange, Abigail spotted a small creek in the distance. Relief flooded through her as she quickened her pace, desperate for water. The rocky terrain made walking difficult, especially in her condition, but the promise of cool water drove her forward. When she finally reached the creek, Abigail fell to her knees at the water's edge, cupping her hands to drink greedily. The water was warm but clean, and she splashed some on her face, washing away days of dust and tears. It was then she heard it, the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Panic seized her. Out here, alone, she was vulnerable. The father of her child, Thomas Blackwell, had been passing through Newton when they'd met. He'd promised to return for her, but that had been 5 months ago. She hadn't heard from him since. Abigail scrambled to her feet, searching frantically for somewhere to hide, but the open terrain offered little shelter. The hoofbeats grew louder, and she braced herself, one arm wrapped protectively around her middle. A tall figure on horseback appeared on the ridge above the creek. As the horse descended toward the water, Abigail got her first clear look at the rider, a man with broad shoulders, a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes, and a day's worth of stubble darkening his jaw. A cowboy, trail-worn and dusty. He spotted her immediately, reining in his horse several yards away. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, her heart hammering in her chest. "Madam," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep with a slight drawl. "You're a fair ways from anywhere out here." Abigail stood as straight as her 7-month belly would allow. "I'm aware of that, sir." His eyes flickered to her stomach, then back to her face, but his expression remained neutral. "Patrick Callahan," he introduced himself. "Most folks call me Pat." "Abigail Turner," she replied, her voice smaller than she'd intended. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Miss Turner?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "You could say that." The cowboy's gaze swept over her, taking in her disheveled appearance, the small bundle of possessions, and again her pregnant belly. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You've been turned out," he stated simply. It wasn't a question. Abigail lifted her chin, fighting back tears. "My family and town decided I was no longer worthy of their company." Patrick Callahan nodded slowly, as if this wasn't the first time he'd encountered such a situation. "And the father, gone." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. The cowboy was quiet for a moment, then led his horse to the water's edge, allowing it to drink. "My ranch is about 5 miles west of here," he said finally. "It's not much, but I've got a spare room. You look like you could use a proper meal and rest." Suspicion flared in Abigail. "And what would you want in return, Mr. Callahan?" His eyes met hers, clear and direct. "Nothing, Miss Turner. I'm offering help, not making a bargain." "Men don't usually offer something for nothing," she countered. "Maybe not where you're from." He shrugged, checking his saddle. "But out here, we understand that sometimes folks need help. Tomorrow's not guaranteed for any of us." Abigail weighed her options. She could continue wandering alone with no destination and dwindling supplies, or she could accept this stranger's offer of shelter. Neither choice seemed particularly wise. As if sensing her indecision, Patrick added, "My sister Martha lives at the ranch too. She'd be glad of the company." The mention of another woman eased some of Abigail's fears. Still, caution made her hesitate. "Look," he said, his tone gentle, "I can see you're exhausted. You can barely stand. That baby you're carrying deserves better than to be born on the trail. Come to the ranch, at least for tonight. Get some food and rest." Another kick from the baby seemed to punctuate his words. Abigail placed a hand on her stomach, knowing he was right. Her pride wasn't worth risking her child's life. "Very well, Mr. Callahan," she conceded. "I accept your offer. For tonight." Relief crossed his features. "Can you ride?" "I grew up on a farm," she said, almost offended. "Of course I can ride." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Pardon my presumption." He led his horse over to her. "I'll walk alongside. Maple's gentle, she won't give you any trouble." With as much dignity as she could muster, Abigail allowed Patrick to help her onto the horse. The moment she settled into the saddle, fatigue washed over her and she swayed slightly. "Easy now," he said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Just hold on to the saddle horn. I've got the reins." As they set off toward his ranch, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, Abigail found herself studying Patrick Callahan from beneath lowered lashes. He wasn't what she'd expected from a cowboy. There was a gentleness to him, a quiet strength that reminded her more of the steady, reliable men from her church than the rough cowboys who occasionally passed through Newton. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "Going on 5 years now," he replied. "It was mostly scrubland when I bought it, but we've made something of it. Got a decent herd of cattle, some horses. My sister Martha and I, our parents died when we were young. Typhoid. We came west from Virginia after the war." Abigail nodded, wondering what circumstances had brought them so far from home. "And it's just the two of you, and a couple of hands who help with the cattle. Good men." He glanced up at her. "You'll be safe there, Miss Turner, I give you my word." Something in the way he said it made her believe him, despite all the reasons she had to distrust men's promises. They traveled in silence for a time, the only sounds the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. As the light faded from the sky, Abigail found herself fighting to stay awake, the gentle rocking motion of the horse nearly lulling her to sleep. "Not much further now," Patrick assured her, his voice pulling her back from the edge of slumber. True to his word, they soon crested a small rise, and in the valley below, Abigail could make out the silhouette of buildings against the darkening sky: a modest ranch house, a barn, and several smaller outbuildings. A lantern glowed in one of the windows, a beacon of warmth and shelter that nearly brought tears to her eyes. As they approached, a figure emerged from the house, a woman with her hair tied back in a practical bun. She shaded her eyes against the last light of day, trying to make them out. "Patrick, is that you?" she called. "It's me, Martha," he answered. "And I've brought a guest." Martha Callahan stepped further into the yard, her expression curious as she took in the sight of Abigail on her brother's horse. If she was surprised or dismayed by Abigail's condition, she didn't show it. "Well, don't just stand there explaining," she said briskly. Bring her inside. Supper's nearly ready and she looks half-starved. Patrick helped Abigail down from the horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he kept a supportive arm around her as they walked toward the house. Martha's bark is worse than her bite, he murmured, but her cooking makes up for both. Despite everything, Abigail found herself smiling faintly as they entered the warmth of the Callahan home. The ranch house was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a large wooden table, and what looked like 2 or 3 doors leading to bedrooms. It was clean and well kept, with handmade quilts draped over the furniture, and the scent of cooking filling the air. Martha, a woman of about 30 with the same dark hair and blue eyes as her brother, ushered Abigail to a chair at the table. "Sit before you fall down, child," she ordered, though there was kindness beneath her commanding tone. "Patrick, fetch some clean water and towels." Abigail sank gratefully into the chair, suddenly aware of how filthy and exhausted she was. When Martha placed a cup of water before her, she drank it down in one long swallow. "Slowly with the next one," Martha advised, refilling the cup. "Too much at once will make you sick." Patrick returned with a basin of water and some clean cloths. "I'll go tend to Maple," he said, retreating tactfully to give the women privacy. Once he was gone, Martha pulled up a chair beside Abigail. "Now then," she said, dipping a cloth in the water and offering it to Abigail. "My brother didn't say much, but I can see well enough what's happened." "How far along are you?" "7 months, I think," Abigail answered, gratefully wiping her face and hands with the damp cloth. "Maybe a little more," Martha nodded. "And your people turned you out?" There was no judgment in her voice, just a matter-of-fact understanding. "Yes, 3 days ago." "Family can be the cruelest of all," Martha said softly. Then, more practically, "Well, you'll stay here tonight, and we'll sort out what's to be done tomorrow. There's a nightgown of mine that should fit over your belly, and we'll wash those clothes of yours." Abigail looked down at the table, unexpected emotion clogging her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for that," Martha replied, rising to check something in the iron pot hanging over the fire. "We've all needed help at one time or another. Now, can you eat some stew?" "It's just rabbit and vegetables, nothing fancy." The mention of hot food made Abigail's stomach growl audibly, and Martha laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." By the time Patrick returned from the barn, Martha had served up 3 bowls of stew and sliced a loaf of bread. He washed his hands at the basin, then joined them at the table. "Eat," he encouraged Abigail, who hesitated briefly before picking up her spoon. She tried to remember her manners, to eat slowly and with dignity, but hunger won out. The stew was the first hot meal she'd had in days, and it tasted better than anything she could remember. Martha and Patrick ate more slowly, exchanging occasional comments about the ranch and the livestock, allowing Abigail to focus on her food without feeling scrutinized. When she finished, Martha wordlessly refilled her bowl. "Thank you," Abigail said, embarrassed by her appetite but too hungry to refuse. "Growing a baby takes a lot of strength," Martha remarked. "You need to eat." After the meal, while Patrick cleaned up, Martha showed Abigail to a small but clean bedroom. "The privy's out back," she explained, "but there's a chamber pot under the bed if you need it during the night. I've laid out a nightgown and left some water for washing." Alone in the small bedroom, Abigail finally allowed herself to cry quiet tears of relief, exhaustion, and lingering fear. She had shelter for tonight, but what of tomorrow? And the day after that? What of the baby due to arrive in a matter of months? She washed as best she could with the basin of water Martha had provided, then slipped into the borrowed nightgown. It was loose enough to accommodate her belly, though a bit long. The bed, A simple frame with a straw-filled mattress and clean linens felt like heaven after nights on the hard ground. As she drifted toward sleep, Abigail could hear the low murmur of voices from the main room, Patrick and Martha discussing her. No doubt. She was too tired to worry about what they might be saying. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. For now, she was safe, fed, and sheltered. It was more than she'd had that morning, and far more than she'd expected. The next morning, Abigail woke to sunlight streaming through the small window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back: her banishment, the desperate journey, meeting Patrick Callahan, and the kindness of his home. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, which someone, Martha, presumably had washed and left folded on a chair. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Martha at the stove, cooking breakfast. "Good morning," Abigail said hesitantly. Martha turned with a smile. "Good morning to you. Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," Abigail admitted. "Thank you for the bed and for washing my clothes." "It was no trouble. Sit and have some breakfast. Pat's already out with the cattle, but he'll be back mid-morning." Abigail sat at the table, watching as Martha fried eggs and bacon. "I'd like to help," she offered. "With the chores, I mean. I'm not useless just because I'm with child." Martha gave her an appraising look. "No, I don't imagine you are, but you need to build up your strength first. Eat and then we'll talk about what needs doing." After breakfast, Abigail insisted on helping with the dishes, and Martha relented. As they worked side by side, Martha asked, "Do you have somewhere to go, Abigail? Family elsewhere who might take you in?" Abigail shook her head. "No, my mother's people are back east, but we've lost touch over the years. I don't even know if they're still alive." "And the father of your child?" Abigail's hands stilled in the dishwater. "He was just passing through Newton. Said he'd come back for me, but—" She trailed off, the familiar shame and anger rising in her throat. Martha nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "Men often make promises they have no intention of keeping." "I was a fool to believe him," Abigail said bitterly. "You were young and in love," Martha corrected gently. "That's not foolish, just human." She took a plate from Abigail to dry it. "What did you do back in Newton?" "I helped my father in his general store, kept the books, ordered supplies, served customers, and I taught reading to some of the younger children on Saturdays." "So you've got a head for numbers and teaching," Martha mused. "That's useful." They continued with the household chores, Martha assigning Abigail the less strenuous tasks. By mid-morning, as promised, Patrick returned to the house. "Ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat as he entered. His eyes sought Abigail's. "How are you feeling this morning, Miss Turner?" "Much better, thank you," she replied, struck again by his quiet courtesy. "Good." He hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Martha, I need to ride into town for some supplies. Thought I'd go after lunch." "Take the wagon," Martha advised. "We need flour and sugar, and those sacks are too heavy for Maple to carry along with everything else." Patrick nodded, then turned to Abigail. "Miss Turner, I've been thinking about your situation." Abigail tensed, preparing herself for the inevitable, the polite suggestion that she move on, now that she was rested and fed. She couldn't blame him. She was, after all, a stranger and a burden. "I have a proposition for you," he continued, his tone carefully measured. "If you're willing to hear it." Martha looked between them, then discreetly excused herself to collect eggs from the chicken coop, leaving them alone. Patrick gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. "Please sit." Abigail lowered herself into one of the chairs, her heart beating rapidly. "What kind of proposition, Mr. Callahan?" He sat opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I know we've only just met, and this may seem forward, but I believe it could benefit us both." He took a deep breath. "I'm offering to give you my name, Miss Turner." She stared at him, not comprehending at first. "Your name, Marriage," he clarified. "I'm proposing marriage." Shock rendered Abigail momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Patrick's expression was earnest. "You need protection and security for yourself and your child. I can provide that, and He hesitated. "I could use a wife. This ranch needs a woman's touch, and Martha's been talking about wanting to move to Tucson, where there's a school that needs teachers." "But you don't know me," Abigail protested. "I'm carrying another man's child." "The child isn't at fault for how it came to be," Patrick said simply. "And I know enough about you. You've got courage and dignity, even in desperate circumstances. That tells me more about your character than a lifetime of Sunday socials." Abigail shook her head, overwhelmed. "This is madness. We're strangers." "Many marriages start with less," he pointed out, "and I'm not asking for. That is, I would expect nothing from you that you're not willing to give. This would be a partnership, Miss Turner, a practical arrangement that benefits us both." "And my child," she asked, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Would be raised as my own," he assured her. "No one need ever know differently." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Abigail found herself speechless once more. Part of her wanted to accept immediately the practical part that understood the dire reality of her situation. But another part, the part that had once dreamed of love and romance, hesitated. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. Patrick nodded as if he'd expected this response. "You don't have to answer now. Think on it. I'll be going into town this afternoon. You have until I return to decide." With that, he rose and left the house, giving her the space to consider his proposal. Martha returned shortly after, a basket of eggs in her hands. One look at Abigail's face told her something significant had occurred. "He asked you to marry him, didn't he?" she guessed, setting down the basket. Abigail nodded, still dazed. "How did you know?" "We discussed it last night," Martha admitted. "It was his idea, but I agreed it made sense." She sat in the chair Patrick had vacated. "My brother is a good man, Abigail. He'd treat you and your child well, but it's so impulsive," Abigail said. "We don't love each other." Martha's expression softened. "Love can grow given time and care, and sometimes, especially out here, we need to be practical. Love is a luxury many can't afford." "Is that why you never married?" Abigail asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that was impertinent." "No, it's a fair question," Martha assured her. "I was engaged once to a man I loved desperately. He died in a mining accident before we could wed after that." She shrugged. "I guess I chose to pour my love into teaching children instead." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in her own thoughts. "I don't want to be a burden to either of you," Abigail finally said. "You wouldn't be," Martha replied firmly. "Patrick needs a wife and that child needs a father. If you stayed, I could finally accept the teaching position in Tucson I've been offered 3 times now." She smiled wryly. "I've been refusing because I didn't want to leave Patrick alone." Abigail considered this. A marriage of convenience wasn't what she had once dreamed of, but her dreams had been shattered the moment Thomas Blackwell rode out of Newton, leaving her with empty promises and a growing child. Now, she needed to be practical. "You think it could work?" she asked Martha. "Truly." "I do," Martha answered without hesitation. "Pat's 32 years old, settled in his ways but not inflexible. He's kind, hardworking, and honest to a fault. He'd be good to you and he'd love that baby as his own, I've no doubt of that." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of chores and conversation, with Abigail learning more about the ranch and the Callahans' history. Patrick returned for the midday meal, treating Abigail with the same quiet respect as before, making no mention of his proposal. After lunch, he prepared to depart for town. As he was hitching the horses to the wagon, Abigail approached him in the yard. "Mr. Callahan," she called softly. He straightened, turning to face her. "Miss Turner." She twisted her hands together, nervous but determined. "I've thought about your offer." Patrick waited, his expression revealing nothing. "I accept," Abigail said, the words rushing out before she could reconsider. "If you're still willing, I'll marry you." Relief and something else, something warmer, flashed in his eyes. "I am still willing," he confirmed. "And I'll do right by you and your child, Miss Turner. You have my word on that." "Abigail," she corrected gently. "If we're to be married, you should call me Abigail." A small smile curved his lips. "Abigail," he repeated. "And I'm Patrick, or Pat if you prefer." She nodded, feeling strangely shy. "When would we?" "I'll speak to the minister in town today," he said. "See if he can come out tomorrow or the next day, unless you'd prefer to wait longer." Abigail shook her head. Given her condition, a quick wedding made the most sense. "Tomorrow or the next day is fine." "Very well." He hesitated, then added, "I'll get you a ring if you want one." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. "That's not necessary," she started to say, but something in his expression stopped her. "But it would be nice," she amended. "Thank you." Patrick nodded, seeming pleased. "I should get going if I'm to make it back before dark." As he climbed up onto the wagon seat, Abigail called, "Patrick." He looked down at her questioningly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." His expression softened. "You're welcome, Abigail." As she watched the wagon disappear down the trail, Abigail felt a curious mixture of emotions: apprehension, relief, and something like hope. She had no illusions about the arrangement she'd just agreed to. This was a marriage of convenience, not love. But perhaps, as Martha had suggested, affection could grow over time. For now, it was enough that she and her child would have a home, security, and the protection of Patrick Callahan's name. When Patrick returned that evening, the wagon loaded with supplies, he brought news that Reverend Wilson had agreed to come to the ranch the following afternoon to perform the ceremony. He was surprised, Patrick admitted as they unloaded the supplies, but not disapproving when I explained the circumstances, that we'd met through Martha's church connections back in Virginia and had been corresponding for months. Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Is that the story we're telling?" "It seemed the simplest explanation," he replied with a shrug. "Unless you'd prefer something else." "No, that works well enough," she agreed. "Though I know nothing about Virginia." "We left when I was 18, Patrick said, handing her a small parcel, "so I don't remember much either." "This is for you." Curious, Abigail unwrapped the parcel to find a simple gold band nestled in a scrap of cloth. It wasn't new or fancy, but it was well made and solid. "It was my mother's," Patrick explained. "Martha's been keeping it, I thought. Well, I thought you might like to have it." Touched beyond words, Abigail looked up at him. "Are you sure? This is a family heirloom. You'll be family tomorrow," he said simply. "It's right that you should have it." That night, as Abigail prepared for bed, she found herself examining the ring more closely. It was well worn, with tiny scratches that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Patrick's mother had worn this ring through childbirth, through raising her children, through all the joys and hardships of a marriage. Now it would be hers. The next day dawned clear and warm. Martha helped Abigail wash her hair and dress in the nicest of her few belongings, a blue calico dress that was a little tight across her growing belly but would have to do. "You look beautiful," Martha assured her, twisting Abigail's hair into a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. A proper bride. Abigail studied her reflection in Martha's small hand mirror. At 19, she had always been considered pretty in Newton with her auburn hair and green eyes. But the past months had taken their toll. There were shadows beneath her eyes, and her cheeks were thinner than they had once been. "I look like exactly what I am," she said with a sigh. "A pregnant girl who's been through hard times." "You look like a woman who survived," Martha corrected firmly. "And that's something to be proud of." The Reverend Wilson arrived mid-afternoon, a portly, good-natured man who greeted Abigail with genuine kindness. He asked no probing questions about her condition or the hasty nature of the wedding, accepting Patrick's story of a long-distance courtship at face value. They gathered in the main room of the ranch house, with Martha as witness. The ceremony was brief but traditional, with Reverend Wilson reading the familiar words from his Bible. When it came time to exchange rings, Patrick gently slid his mother's band onto Abigail's finger. He looked momentarily surprised when Abigail produced a plain silver ring for him. "It was my father's," she explained quietly. "The only thing I took when I left." Patrick's eyes met hers, understanding passing between them. He extended his hand, allowing her to place the ring on his finger. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Wilson concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Callahan." There was an awkward pause. They hadn't discussed this part, and Abigail felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Then Patrick leaned forward and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss to her lips. It was brief but not cold, a seal on their agreement, a promise of respect. After a simple meal prepared by Martha, Reverend Wilson departed with well wishes for the newlyweds. An uncomfortable silence fell over the house as evening approached, the reality of their new situation settling in. Martha, sensing the tension, announced that she would stay with her friend Emma in town that night, giving the newlyweds privacy. Before Patrick could protest, she had packed a small bag and hitched up the wagon. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon," she told them, hugging Abigail warmly. "Don't worry about a thing, just get some rest." And then they were a lone husband and wife of less than 6 hours, virtual strangers bound by vows and circumstance. "Are you hungry?" Patrick asked, breaking the silence. "There's leftover stew." "No, thank you," Abigail replied, though in truth she was too nervous to eat. "I should." "That is, where will I sleep?" Patrick cleared his throat. Our room now, I suppose, is the larger one, but I can take Martha's room if you'd be more comfortable." Abigail considered this. Part of her wanted to accept his offer, to postpone the inevitable awkwardness of sharing a bed. But another part recognized that maintaining separate rooms would only prolong the strangeness between them. "We're married now," she said carefully. "I think we should try to live as husband and wife, even if our arrangement is unconventional." Patrick nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "As you wish. I'll just check on the livestock and lock up for the night." While he was outside, Abigail slipped into their bedroom now, and changed into her nightgown. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. Yesterday, she had been a homeless, unwed mother-to-be with no prospects. Today, she was Mrs. Patrick Callahan, with a home, security, and a husband she barely knew. When Patrick returned, he moved about the room with careful politeness, keeping his distance as he gathered his own nightclothes. He excused himself to change elsewhere, returning in a simple cotton nightshirt and trousers. "Which side do you prefer?" he asked, gesturing to the bed. "Either is fine," she replied, her voice sounding unnaturally high to her own ears. Patrick nodded and extinguished the lamp before climbing into the far side of the bed. Abigail lay down as well, acutely aware of his presence beside her, though he was careful not to touch her. "Good night, Abigail," he said softly into the darkness. "Good night, Patrick." She lay awake long after his breathing had deepened into sleep, wondering what the future held for this strange union they had formed. The next morning, Abigail woke to find Patrick already gone from the bed. She dressed quickly and found him in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," she lied, not wanting to admit how long she'd lain awake. "Can I help with breakfast? It's nearly done," he said. "But thank you." They ate in relative silence, the awkwardness of the previous night still lingering between them. After breakfast, Patrick explained that he needed to check on a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. "Would you like to come?" he offered. "It's not too far and the fresh air might do you good." Surprised but pleased by the invitation, Abigail agreed. Patrick saddled 2 horses Maple for himself and a gentle mare named Daisy for Abigail. "Are you sure I should be riding?" she asked, concerned about her pregnancy. "It's a short, easy ride," he assured her, "and Daisy's smooth as silk, but if you'd rather not, I understand." Abigail considered this, then decided to risk it. "No, I'd like to come. I want to see more of the ranch." As they rode, Patrick pointed out various features of his property, the best grazing areas, the creek that provided water year-round, the distant mountains that marked the boundary of his land. "It's beautiful," Abigail remarked, genuinely impressed by the landscape. The Arizona Territory was so different from the more settled areas she'd known in Newton Wilder, more open, with a rugged beauty that took her breath away. "It grows on you," Patrick agreed. "When I first saw it, I thought it was just scrubland. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." They reached the damaged section of fence and Patrick dismounted to examine it. Abigail remained on horseback, watching as he assessed the work needed. "How did you come to own this ranch?" she asked, curious about the man who was now her husband. Patrick straightened, pushing his hat back. "Won it in a poker game," he admitted with a wry smile. "Though that's not the story I tell in polite company." Surprised, Abigail laughed. "Really? Really?" He leaned against a fence post. "I was working as a drover, moving cattle up from Texas. Got into a game with a man who'd had too much to drink. He put up the deed to this place against my season's wages." Patrick shook his head at the memory. "I wasn't much of a gambler, but I had a decent hand and figured it was worth the risk." "And you won," Abigail concluded. "I did." "Sobered that fellow right up, I can tell you." Patrick's expression grew more serious. "I offered to tear up the deed, let him keep the place, but he said he was heading to California anyway, said the land was worthless. But you stayed." "I stayed," Patrick confirmed. "Sent for Martha and we started building. First year was hard, lost half our cattle to drought and rustlers, but we stuck it out." Abigail was impressed by his determination. "And now we've got 60 head of cattle, 8 horses, and enough land to expand when the time is right." He looked around with quiet pride. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's ours." "Ours," Abigail repeated softly, testing the word. Patrick's eyes met hers. "Yes, ours now, yours and mine." Something shifted between them in that moment, a small acknowledgement of their shared future. A tiny bridge across the gulf of their unfamiliarity. They returned to the house to find Martha had arrived from town, bringing with her news and gossip. She greeted Abigail with a knowing look that made her blush, though nothing untoward had occurred between her and Patrick. "I've decided to accept the teaching position in Tucson," Martha announced during lunch. "If you two will be all right without me." Patrick looked surprised but not displeased. "You're sure, Martha? You've been turning them down for months." "I'm sure," she replied firmly. "It's time I made my own way. Besides, Abigail is here now to look after you and the house." Abigail felt a flicker of panic at the thought of Martha leaving. The older woman had become a buffer between her and Patrick, easing the awkwardness of their situation. "When would you go?" Abigail asked. "Next week," Martha said. "The school term starts in 2 weeks, and I need time to find lodgings and prepare." It was happening so quickly. Abigail forced a smile, not wanting to betray her anxiety. "We'll miss you," she said sincerely. "And I'll miss you both," Martha replied. "But I'll visit, and you can come to Tucson when the baby's old enough to travel." The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity, as Martha began sorting through her belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave. Abigail helped where she could, while Patrick worked outside with the ranch hands. That night, their second as husband and wife was less awkward than the first, though still marked by careful politeness. Patrick again kept to his side of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. As the days passed and Martha's departure drew closer, Abigail found herself taking on more household responsibilities. She discovered that she enjoyed keeping the house, cooking meals, and creating order from the bachelor chaos that had reigned before her arrival. Patrick seemed to appreciate her efforts, complimenting her cooking and thanking her for the small touches she added to their home wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains hung at the previously bare windows, a quilt she'd found and mended spread across their bed. The night before Martha was to leave, the three of them sat around the fireplace after dinner. Martha had been sharing stories from their childhood in Virginia, and Patrick was more relaxed and animated than Abigail had ever seen him. "Remember that Christmas when Pa dressed as Santa Claus and got stuck in the chimney?" he asked Martha, chuckling at the memory. "How could I forget?" Martha laughed. "Mother was beside herself, and the neighbors had to come help pull him out." Abigail smiled, enjoying their stories and the glimpse they provided into Patrick's past. "You must have had a happy childhood," she remarked. "We did," Martha agreed, her expression softening. "Until the war came." She glanced at Patrick, who had grown suddenly quiet. "Pat was 16 when he enlisted. Lied about his age." "You fought in the war?" Abigail asked, surprised. Patrick seemed too young to have been a soldier in the Civil War. "Briefly," he replied, his tone indicating he didn't wish to discuss it further. Martha deftly changed the subject, but Abigail filed away this new information about her husband, another piece of the puzzle that was Patrick Callahan. The next morning, they said their goodbyes to Martha. There were tears and promises to write, and then she was gone, the wagon carrying her toward her new life in Tucson. Abigail and Patrick stood side by side in the yard, watching until the wagon disappeared from view. Then, suddenly, they were truly alone together, no longer newlyweds in the technical sense, but still virtual strangers learning to be husband and wife. "Well," Patrick said finally, turning to Abigail, "I suppose it's just us now." She nodded, uncertain what to say. "I've got work to do with the cattle today," he continued, "but I should be back for supper." "I'll have it ready," Abigail promised. It wasn't much, but it was something concrete. She could offer a hot meal, a clean house, the small comforts of domesticity. As the days turned into weeks, they established a routine. Patrick worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the ranch with the help of 2 hired hands, Miguel and Jim. Abigail managed the household, gradually making it more of a home. They were polite to each other, even friendly, but there remained a careful distance between them. At night, they continued to sleep side by side without touching. Occasionally, Abigail would wake to find Patrick's arm had drifted across the space between them in sleep, his hand resting near hers, but by morning, he was always back on his side of the bed. As her pregnancy progressed, entering its 8th month, Abigail found certain tasks becoming more difficult. Patrick noticed her struggling to hang laundry one day, her swollen belly making it hard to reach the line. Without comment, he stepped in and took the wet clothes from her hands, hanging them with efficient movements. "You should have called for help," he said, not unkindly. "I didn't want to bother you," she replied. "You have enough work of your own." Patrick frowned slightly. "We're married, Abigail. That means we help each other." He hesitated, then added, "You're not a burden. I hope you know that." The simple statement touched her more deeply than she expected. "Thank you," she said softly. After that, Patrick made a point of checking on her throughout the day when he was nearby, offering assistance with tasks that had become difficult. He brought her a sturdy stool to use in the kitchen when standing became too tiring, and constructed a clothesline at a lower height so she could hang laundry more easily. These small kindnesses, offered without fuss or expectation of gratitude, began to chip away at the walls Abigail had built around her heart. She found herself watching for Patrick's return in the evenings, looking forward to their quiet conversations over supper. One evening in late October, as autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Abigail sat on the porch, enjoying the cooler air. Her back ached from the weight of the baby, but it was a beautiful evening and she couldn't bear to stay inside. Patrick found her there when he returned from checking on a newborn calf. He sat beside her on the bench, close but not touching. "Beautiful sunset," he remarked, his gaze on the horizon where the sky blazed with color. "It is," she agreed. "I never tire of it." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the light faded from the sky. Then Abigail shifted uncomfortably, trying to ease the persistent ache in her lower back. Patrick noticed immediately. "Are you in pain?" "Just the usual discomforts," she assured him. "The baby's getting heavy." Without asking, Patrick moved behind her on the bench and placed his hands on her lower back, his thumbs pressing gently on either side of her spine. The unexpected touch startled her, but as his fingers worked the tense muscles, Abigail found herself relaxing into his ministrations. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice low near her ear. "Yes," she breathed. "It helps, thank you." His hands were strong and sure, easing the ache that had plagued her all day. It was the first time he had touched her with any intimacy since their wedding kiss, and Abigail was surprised by how comforting it felt. "My mother had 7 children," Patrick said conversationally, his hands still moving on her back. "She used to say the last month was the longest." "7," Abigail groaned. "Don't tell me that, I can barely manage one." Patrick chuckled, the sound vibrating through his chest against her back. "You're stronger than you think, Abigail. I've seen it every day since you came here." The simple faith in his words warmed her. When he finished the massage and moved back to sit beside her, Abigail felt bereft of his touch. "Thank you," she said again, feeling somehow shy. "That helped tremendously." Patrick nodded, his eyes on her face. In the fading light, his expression was softer than usual, almost tender. For a moment, Abigail thought he might reach for her hand or perhaps even kiss her. But the moment passed, and he stood, offering her his arm to help her rise. "Supper should be ready," she said, accepting his assistance. "I made stew." "Sounds perfect," he replied, and they went inside together, something subtle but significant having shifted between them. That night, as they prepared for bed, Abigail found herself watching Patrick covertly as he moved about the room. In the nearly 2 months since their hasty wedding, she had come to know many things about him: that he preferred coffee to tea, that he whistled tunelessly when lost in thought, that he was patient with skittish horses and gentle with newborn calves. But there was still so much she didn't know, so many aspects of the man who was her husband that remained mysterious to her. "Patrick," she said suddenly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "May I ask you something personal?" He looked up, surprised. "Of course." "Why did you really offer to marry me?" The question had been haunting her for weeks. The truth, please." Patrick considered her for a long moment, then sat beside her, leaving a careful space between them. "The first reason I gave you was true enough," he began. "You needed protection, and well, I've been alone a long time." "But that's not all," Abigail prompted, sensing there was more. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "No, that's not all." He was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might not continue. "Then, my sister Martha was in a similar situation once. Years ago, before we came west." Abigail's eyes widened. "Martha was with child, yes. The man was a Confederate officer who promised to marry her after the war." Patrick's jaw tightened. "He died at Gettysburg. Martha lost the baby not long after, from grief, I think." "I'm so sorry," Abigail whispered, understanding now why Martha had been so kind, so accepting. "She never really recovered from it," Patrick continued. "Not completely. When I found you by that creek looking so lost and afraid," he shook his head, "I couldn't just ride on by. And then, as I got to know you, I realized you had a strength Martha never had. You were determined to survive, to protect your child no matter what. So you married me out of pity," Abigail concluded, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and disappointment. "No," Patrick said firmly. "Not pity. Admiration, maybe, and—" he hesitated, "and perhaps a selfish desire not to be alone anymore." Abigail considered this. It wasn't the declaration of love she might have once dreamed of, but it was honest, and in its own way it was more meaningful than empty words of passion. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. Patrick nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "You deserved the truth." That night, for the first time when they lay down to sleep, Abigail moved slightly closer to Patrick, not quite touching but near enough to feel the warmth of his body. He remained still, but she sensed his awareness of her proximity. "Good night, Patrick," she murmured. "Good night, Abigail," he replied, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. As November arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain, Abigail entered the final weeks of her pregnancy. The baby was active now, kicking and shifting constantly. Patrick had seen her wince one evening as a particularly forceful kick caught her under the ribs. "Does it hurt?" he'd asked, curious. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Mostly it's just strange. Knowing there's a whole person in there, getting ready to come out." Patrick had nodded, looking slightly intimidated by the prospect. "Martha sent word that she's arranged for a midwife to come stay with us when your time is near. A woman named Mrs. Ramirez from one of the families near Tucson." Abigail was touched by Martha's thoughtfulness and relieved to know she wouldn't face childbirth alone. "When will she arrive?" "Any day now," Patrick replied. "Martha was very insistent that she be here well before the baby." Sure enough, 3 days later, Mrs. Ramirez arrived, a stout, cheerful woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner that immediately put Abigail at ease. She spoke English with a heavy Spanish accent and carried with her a wealth of knowledge about childbirth and infant care. "You have a good, strong baby," she declared after examining Abigail. "Everything looks as it should. 2 weeks, maybe 3, and you will meet your little one." Patrick had tactfully made himself scarce during the examination, but Mrs. Ramirez insisted on speaking with both of them afterward. "First baby is always the hardest," she told Patrick bluntly. "Your wife will need you to be strong for her." He nodded seriously. "I'll do whatever is necessary." Mrs. Ramirez patted his arm approvingly. "Good man. Now there are things to prepare. Clean linens, hot water, a cradle for the baby." Patrick looked momentarily overwhelmed, but he rallied quickly. "Tell me what's needed, and I'll see to it." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Patrick constructed a simple but sturdy cradle, while Abigail and Mrs. Ramirez sewed baby clothes from soft flannel. The imminent arrival of the child made their unusual situation more real. And Abigail found herself wondering how Patrick would truly feel when faced with another man's baby. Her concerns were put to rest one evening when she found him sitting alone by the fire, sanding the cradle to a smooth finish. "It's beautiful," she said, admiring his craftsmanship. Patrick looked up with a smile. "Do you think so? I'm not much of a carpenter." "It's perfect." Abigail ran her hand along the curved edge. "The baby will love it, I hope so." Patrick set aside his sandpaper and stood, stretching. "I was thinking, we should probably decide on names." The suggestion caught Abigail by surprise. "Oh, yes, I suppose we should. Do you have any preferences?" he asked. Abigail had thought about names, of course, but had never expected to be discussing them with Patrick. "If it's a girl, I've always liked the name Elizabeth," she admitted. "After my grandmother." Patrick nodded approvingly. "Elizabeth Callahan has a nice sound to it." The name her child with Patrick's surname struck Abigail forcefully. This baby would be a Callahan, would bear Patrick's name, would grow up calling him father. The realization brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Abigail?" Patrick asked, concerned by her sudden emotion. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," she assured him quickly, wiping her eyes. "It's just, hearing the name like that, it makes it real." Understanding softened his features. He stepped closer, his hand hovering uncertainly near her shoulder before settling there in a gentle touch. "It is real. This child will be a Callahan, same as you and me." Abigail looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For making a place for us. For giving us your name." She placed her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. "For being a better man than the one who left me." Something flickered in Patrick's eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment, Abigail thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently squeezed her shoulder. "What if it's a boy?" he asked, his voice slightly rougher than before. Abigail hadn't considered boy names as carefully. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Do you have any ideas?" "I've always been partial to James," Patrick said. "After my father, James Callahan." Abigail tested the name. "I like it." They stood close together, discussing names and possibilities for their child's future. And for the first time, Abigail felt truly like Patrick's wife, not in the legal sense, which she had been for months, but in the deeper sense of partnership and shared purpose. That night, when they went to bed, Patrick's arm slid around her waist, his hand coming to rest on the swell of her belly. It was the first time he had deliberately held her while they slept, and Abigail felt a flutter of something that wasn't entirely about the baby kicking beneath his palm. "Is this all right?" he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Yes," she replied softly. "It's more than all right." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly energetic kick right against Patrick's hand. He started in surprise, then chuckled. "Strong little thing," he remarked. "Like its mother," Abigail said, echoing his earlier words. She felt rather than saw his smile in the darkness. "Yes," he agreed, his arm tightening slightly around her. "Just like its mother." The weeks of waiting stretched Abigail's patience to its limits. Her body felt impossibly heavy and unwieldy, and simple tasks became monumental efforts. Mrs. Ramirez was a godsend, taking over much of the cooking and housework, sharing stories of her own 6 children and numerous grandchildren to distract Abigail from her discomfort. Patrick, too, was attentive and solicitous. He rearranged furniture to make moving around the house easier for Abigail, brought her wildflowers he found on his rides around the property, and continued the nightly back massages that had become a cherished ritual. As November waned and December approached, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional frost, Abigail felt a change in her body, a heaviness, a sense of the baby dropping lower. Mrs. Ramirez nodded knowingly when Abigail described the sensation. "The baby prepares," she said simply. "Not long now." She was right. 2 nights later, Abigail woke to a cramping pain that wrapped around her middle like a vise. She gasped, clutching at her belly as the sensation peaked, then gradually eased. Beside her, Patrick stirred. "Abigail, what is it? I think." She paused, waiting to be sure. Another cramp seized her and she gripped Patrick's arm. "I think the baby's coming." He was instantly awake, sitting up and lighting the lamp beside the bed. "I'll get Mrs. Ramirez." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and exertion. Mrs. Ramirez took charge, sending Patrick to heat water and bring clean linens. Abigail labored through the night, gripping the bedposts during contractions, walking the floor between them as Mrs. Ramirez encouraged. Patrick hovered anxiously, torn between wanting to help and feeling utterly useless in the face of Abigail's pain. Finally, Mrs. Ramirez sent him outside. "Men are no good at this part," she said firmly. "Go check on your cattle. We will call you when it is time." Banished from his own home, Patrick paced the yard, wincing at each cry that escaped through the windows. The ranch hands, arriving for their day's work, found him there, haggard and tense. "First baby's always the hardest, boss," Miguel said sympathetically. "My Juanita had 6, and I nearly died each time." The morning wore on, and still Abigail labored. Patrick found tasks to occupy his hands, if not his mind, chopping wood, mending tack, anything to distract himself from the sounds of his wife's struggle. Finally, as the winter sun reached its zenith, a different cry split the air, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Patrick froze, axe halfway through a log, his heart hammering in his chest. The door to the house opened and Mrs. Ramirez appeared, her apron stained but her face wreathed in smiles. "Senor Callahan," she called, "come meet your son." A son. Patrick set down the axe with hands that suddenly trembled. He crossed the yard in long strides, barely aware of the congratulatory slaps on his back from Miguel and Jim. Inside, the house was warm and quiet, the baby's cries having subsided to occasional whimpers. Mrs. Ramirez led him to the bedroom where Abigail reclined against pillows, her face pale and exhausted but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny bundle. Patrick stopped in the doorway, suddenly hesitant. This was the moment he had both anticipated and dreaded, the moment when he would first see the child who was not his by blood but would be his in name and, he hoped, in heart. Abigail looked up, her eyes finding his. "Come and see him, Patrick," she said softly. "Come meet your son." He moved to the bedside, almost afraid to look. But when Abigail folded back the blanket to reveal the baby's face, all his fears dissolved. The child was perfect, red-faced and wrinkled, with a thatch of dark hair and tiny fists curled against his cheeks. "James," Abigail said, confirming the name they had chosen. "James Patrick Callahan." Patrick's throat tightened at the unexpected honor of his own name being given to the boy. He reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful," he said hoarsely. "Like his mother." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Would you like to hold him?" Before Patrick could answer, she was already transferring the bundle to his arms. He accepted the baby carefully, terrified of his own strength against such fragility. But the moment James settled against his chest, something shifted inside Patrick, a protective instinct so powerful it took his breath away. "Hello, James," he whispered. "I'm your pa." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, felt right, natural. As if this child truly were his own. When he looked up, he found Abigail watching him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something warm and hopeful. "Thank you," she said simply. Patrick knew she meant more than just for holding the baby. She was thanking him for accepting James, for giving them both his name, for creating this family from the broken pieces of her past. "No," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, Abigail, for my son, Mrs." Ramirez discreetly left the room, giving them this moment of privacy. Patrick sat on the edge of the bed, cradling James in one arm, his free hand reaching for Abigail's. "You should rest," he told her. "You've done amazing work today." She smiled tiredly, squeezing his fingers. "I am tired. But I'm also happy." She looked surprised at her own admission. "Happier than I thought I could be again." Patrick understood. The past months had transformed them both from strangers bound by a convenient arrangement to something more, something deeper. Not quite love, perhaps, not yet, but a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. "Sleep," he urged. "I'll watch over James." Abigail's eyes were already drooping. "Promise you'll wake me if he needs feeding." "I promise," Patrick assured her, though he had no intention of disturbing her rest unless absolutely necessary. As Abigail drifted into exhausted slumber, Patrick remained by her side, his son cradled against his heart, his wife's hand still in his. Looking at them, his family, he felt a fierce surge of protectiveness and pride. James Patrick Callahan had been born on December 1, 1882. The date would forever be marked in Patrick's memory as the day he truly became a husband and father, not just in name but in his soul. The early weeks of James's life passed in a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Abigail recovered quickly from the birth, her young body resilient despite the ordeal. Mrs. Ramirez stayed for 2 weeks, teaching Abigail how to nurse, bathe, and care for the infant, before returning to her own family just before Christmas. Patrick threw himself into fatherhood with the same quiet determination he brought to ranching. He rose in the night to bring James to Abigail for feedings, changed diapers with growing competence, and spent long hours simply holding the boy, marveling at his tiny features. To Patrick's surprise, he saw no trace of another man in James's face. The baby had Abigail's green eyes and fair skin, with dark hair that could have come from either parent. It made it easier to forget that James wasn't his by blood, not that Patrick needed the reminder erased. He had long since decided that biology mattered less than choice, and he had chosen to be this child's father in every way that counted. Christmas came, bringing with it a rare snowfall that dusted the Arizona landscape in white. Patrick and Abigail celebrated quietly, exchanging simple gifts, a knitted scarf from her to him, and from him to her, a silver locket containing a tiny lock of James's hair. "It's beautiful," Abigail said, touching the locket reverently after Patrick fastened it around her neck. "Martha sent it from Tucson," he admitted, "but the idea was mine. I love it." She hesitated, then rose on tiptoe to kiss his cheek, their first such gesture of affection outside the formal kiss at their wedding. "Thank you, Patrick." He caught her hand as she started to move away, his eyes meeting hers. For a long moment they stood close together, something unspoken passing between them. Then James let out a hungry wail from his cradle, breaking the spell. Abigail smiled ruefully. "Duty calls." Patrick released her hand reluctantly, watching as she went to tend to their son. The moment had passed, but something had changed between them, another small step toward the kind of marriage they both, perhaps, were beginning to want. As winter gave way to spring, the ranch demanded more of Patrick's time. The cattle needed moving to fresh pastures, fences required repair after winter storms, and preparations had to be made for the coming season. He rode out at dawn and often didn't return until dusk, falling into bed exhausted beside Abigail. Despite his fatigue, Patrick made a point of spending time with James each day. The boy was growing rapidly, his personality emerging in gummy smiles and determined kicks. He had Abigail's stubborn chin and, Patrick liked to think, his own curiosity about the world. One evening in late March, Patrick returned from a long day of branding calves to find the house unusually quiet. Concerned, he called out, "Abigail, out here," came her reply from the porch. He found her sitting in the rocking chair he'd made during her pregnancy, James asleep in her arms. The setting sun painted them in golden light, creating a tableau so beautiful it stopped Patrick in his tracks. "He just fell asleep," Abigail whispered. "I didn't want to move him yet." Patrick nodded, understanding. He lowered himself onto the porch step beside her chair, his body aching from the day's labor but his heart full at the sight of his wife and son. "How was your day?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Good," Abigail replied. "James rolled over by himself this morning. I couldn't believe it." Pride surged through Patrick. "Already? Isn't that early?" Mrs. Ramirez said some babies are more determined than others. Abigail smiled down at their sleeping son. "He definitely has opinions about how things should be." "Like his mother," Patrick observed with a small grin. Abigail arched an eyebrow. "I was going to say like his father, but perhaps we're both stubborn." The casual reference to Patrick as James's father never failed to warm him. It had become natural now, for both of them, to speak of their family as if it had always been thus, as if James were the product of their union, not a reminder of Abigail's past. They sat in companionable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, bringing the first chill of evening. Finally, Patrick rose to his feet. "I'll take him," he offered, holding out his arms for the baby. "You've been holding him all day." Abigail transferred James carefully. The boy stirred but didn't wake, settling against Patrick's broad chest with a sigh. "He knows he's safe with you," Abigail remarked, watching them. Patrick looked down at his son's peaceful face. "I hope so," he said softly. "I want him to always feel that way." As they went inside together, Abigail lighting lamps while Patrick laid James in his cradle, Patrick found himself thinking about the strange path that had led them here. 9 months ago, he had been a solitary rancher with a sister about to leave and a future that looked much like his present. Now he was a husband and father, with responsibilities and joys he hadn't imagined. Later that night, after a simple supper and household chores, they retired to their bedroom. As had become their custom, Patrick held Abigail close, her back against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist. But tonight, something was different. Abigail seemed restless, shifting in his embrace. "What's wrong?" he murmured against her hair. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might have fallen asleep. Then, "Patrick, are you happy with this arrangement?" The unexpected question took him by surprise. "Of course I am," he answered truthfully. "Why would you ask that?" Abigail turned in his arms to face him, her expression serious in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "We married for practical reasons," she reminded him. "You were kind enough to offer me and James your protection, your name, but it's not a real marriage, not in all ways." Patrick's heart began to beat faster as he understood her meaning. In the months since their wedding, they had shared a bed, but nothing more intimate than embraces and occasional chaste kisses. "I've never wanted to pressure you," he said carefully. "After what you've been through with the baby's father, I thought." "I know," Abigail interrupted gently, "and I'm grateful for your consideration, but Patrick—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not thinking of the past anymore when I look at you." Patrick swallowed hard, hardly daring to hope she meant what he thought she did. "What are you thinking of then?" he asked, his voice rough. "The future," she replied simply. "Our future as a real family, as a real husband and wife." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Patrick raised a hand to cup her cheek. "Is that what you want, Abigail, a real marriage?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes steady on his. I think I've wanted it for some time now." The admission sent a wave of warmth through Patrick. He had been careful not to examine his own growing feelings too closely, afraid of wanting more than Abigail was ready to give. But now, hearing her words, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth that somewhere along the way, his convenient arrangement had become something far more significant. "I want that too," he admitted, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "Very much." Abigail's eyes softened and she leaned into his touch. "Then perhaps we should start now," she suggested, a hint of shyness in her voice despite her boldness. Patrick searched her face, needing to be certain. "You're sure?" In answer, Abigail closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was nothing like the brief, ceremonial one they had shared at their wedding. This was a true kiss, tender at first, then deepening as Patrick responded, his arms tightening around her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Patrick rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for months," he confessed. Abigail smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Why didn't you?" "I was waiting for you to be ready," he said simply. Her expression grew serious. "I'm ready now, Patrick. I want to be your wife in every sense." He kissed her again, pouring into it all the feelings he had kept carefully contained: his admiration for her strength, his tenderness for the mother of his son, and the growing love he could no longer deny. That night, their marriage truly began not as a practical arrangement between strangers, but as a union of two people who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were seeking. Afterward, with Abigail curled against him, her head on his chest, Patrick felt a sense of rightness, of completion. "I love you," he said quietly, the words he'd been holding back finally finding voice. "I think I have for a long time." Abigail raised her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the darkness. "I love you too, Patrick Callahan," she replied. "You and our son, you're everything to me." James chose that moment to whimper from his cradle, as if sensing he was being discussed. Abigail laughed softly and made to rise, but Patrick stopped her. "I'll get him," he offered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. He brought the baby to their bed, and together they soothed James back to sleep, a family complete at last. As spring blossomed into summer, Patrick and Abigail's relationship deepened and strengthened. The awkwardness that had marked their early days together was long gone, replaced by the easy intimacy of a couple truly in love. They worked side by side during the day, Patrick managing the ranch while Abigail tended to James and the household, and spent their nights in each other's arms, making up for the months of restraint. James thrived under their care, growing from a newborn into an active, curious infant. By his 6th month, he was sitting up unassisted, babbling constantly and reaching for everything within his grasp. His first word, to Abigail's delight and Patrick's pride, was "Pa," a gurgling approximation that nevertheless brought tears to Patrick's eyes the first time he heard it. Martha visited from Tucson when James was 7 months old, bringing gifts and news from the growing town. She seemed genuinely happy in her new role as a schoolteacher, though she admitted to missing the ranch and her brother's family. "You two look different," she observed on her second day, watching Patrick and Abigail move around each other in the kitchen, their gestures marked by casual touches and shared smiles. "Different how?" Abigail asked, though her blush suggested she knew exactly what Martha meant. "Happier," Martha replied simply. "Like a real married couple." Patrick caught Abigail's eye across the room and winked. "We are a real married couple, Martha." His sister smiled knowingly. "So I see." During Martha's visit, Patrick took the opportunity to discuss a matter that had been on his mind for some time. One evening, while Abigail was bathing James, He sat with his sister on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze after a hot summer day. "I've been thinking about making the ranch house bigger," he told her. "Adding a proper bedroom for James as he grows, maybe another room or two for the future." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Planning on more children, are you?" Patrick couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. "We hope so, not right away, but someday." "I'm happy for you, Pat," Martha said sincerely. "For both of you. When you first brought Abigail here, I wasn't sure how it would work out, but I've never seen you like this settled, content." "I am," he agreed. "More than I ever thought possible." Martha's expression grew more serious. "Have you told her everything? About the war, about what happened after?" Patrick's smile faded. "Not everything, no. Some things are better left in the past." "Perhaps," Martha conceded, "but secrets have a way of surfacing eventually. And marriage should be built on honesty." Patrick knew she was right, but the thought of sharing certain parts of his past with Abigail filled him with dread. What if it changed how she saw him? What if it damaged the precious bond they had formed? But Martha's words lingered, and after she returned to Tucson, Patrick found himself contemplating how to broach the subject with Abigail. The opportunity came one night in late August, as they sat on the porch after putting James to bed. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky like diamonds on black velvet. Patrick had his arm around Abigail, her head resting on his shoulder, when she asked a seemingly innocent question. "You never talk about the war," she observed. "Were you in many battles?" Patrick tensed slightly, and Abigail felt it. She lifted her head to look at him. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "If you'd rather not discuss it, no," he interrupted gently. "You have a right to know, it's just not easy to talk about." Abigail took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." Patrick drew a deep breath. "I was young when I enlisted 16, though I told the recruiter I was 18. My father had died earlier that year, and I felt I had to do my part for Virginia. I was assigned to a cavalry unit under General Stewart." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I saw action at Second Bull Run at Antietam. It wasn't what I expected. The glory they promised didn't exist. There was only mud and blood and the screams of dying men and horses." Abigail squeezed his hand but remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "At Chancellorsville, I was wounded, not badly, just a ball through the shoulder. While I was recovering, my unit moved north with Lee's army. They were at Gettysburg without me." His voice grew strained. "Many of them didn't come back, including Martha's fiancé." "She told me about him," Abigail said softly. "About losing him and the baby." Patrick nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "After I recovered, I rejoined what was left of my unit, but I was different, harder, angrier. When the war finally ended, I couldn't go back to being who I was before." He fell silent, and Abigail waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "After Appomattox," Patrick finally continued, "I drifted, did whatever work I could find, some of it." He hesitated. "Some of it wasn't honorable. I rode with some rough men for a while. We robbed a bank in Tennessee." Abigail's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away or interrupt. "No one was hurt," Patrick hastened to add. "But it was wrong. I knew it was wrong even then. After that, I split from the group, headed west. Worked as a drover, a ranch hand, anything to put distance between me and what I'd done." He turned to face Abigail directly. "I'm not proud of that time in my life, but I want you to know all of me, Abigail, the good and the bad. And I need you to understand that the man I was then isn't who I am now." Abigail studied his face, her expression thoughtful. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I love you," he said simply. "Because I don't want secrets between us, and because—" He took a deep breath. "Because if someday someone from that past should appear, I don't want you to be blindsided." "Do you think that's likely?" Abigail asked, a hint of concern in her voice. "No," Patrick assured her. "It was a long time ago and I've been careful to leave that life behind, but I needed you to know." Abigail was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had told her. Finally, she reached up to touch his cheek. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "It doesn't change how I feel about you, Patrick. We've all made mistakes, taken wrong turns. What matters is who you are now, the man I love, James's father, my husband." The relief that washed over Patrick was profound. He pulled Abigail into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "I don't deserve you," he murmured into her hair. "Yes, you do," she countered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "We deserve each other and the happiness we've found. The past is behind us, Patrick. All that matters is our future." As they held each other under the starlit sky, Patrick felt the last of his barriers falling away. He had given Abigail his name, his protection, his love, and now his complete trust. In return, she had given him forgiveness, acceptance, and a family he had never dared to hope for. The seasons turned and James's first birthday approached. Abigail planned a small celebration, inviting Martha from Tucson and the ranch hands and their families. Patrick watched with pride as she transformed their modest home with decorations she had been crafting for weeks, paper streamers, a banner bearing James's name, and a cake that had taken 3 attempts to perfect. "It's just a few people," he teased gently, finding her fussing over the table settings the morning of the party. "And James won't remember it anyway." Abigail shot him a look that was half exasperation, half amusement. "It's his first birthday, Patrick. I want it to be special." "It will be," he assured her, pulling her into his arms, "because you've made it so." The celebration was indeed special, not for its grandeur, but for the joy that filled their home. James, now walking with the assistance of furniture and occasionally taking tentative steps on his own, was the center of attention, charming everyone with his infectious laugh and curious nature. Martha brought a handmade wooden horse for her nephew, carved by one of her fellow teachers. Miguel's wife, Elena, gifted a tiny pair of soft leather moccasins she had made herself. Even gruff old Jim had whittled a set of blocks from scraps of pine. As James sat in the middle of the floor, surrounded by his gifts and new admirers, Abigail came to stand beside Patrick, her arm slipping around his waist. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely," she replied. "I never imagined when you found me by that creek that life could be this good again." Patrick looked around at their home, filled with friends and laughter, at his son playing happily on the floor and at his wife beside him, her face radiant with contentment. "Nor did I," he admitted. "You've given me more than I ever thought to have, Abigail." As the party wound down and their guests departed, Patrick noticed Abigail growing quieter, a pensive look crossing her face whenever she thought he wasn't watching. After James was put to bed, exhausted from the excitement of the day, Patrick found her on the porch, gazing at the sunset. "Something's troubling you," he said, not a question but an observation. After more than a year together, he could read her moods as clearly as the weather signs on the horizon. Abigail turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Not troubling exactly, just thinking." Patrick sat beside her on the bench, waiting. He had learned that Abigail would speak when she was ready, and pushing would only make her retreat. "I received a letter today," she said finally. "From Newton." Patrick stiffened. In all the time she had been with him, Abigail had never received correspondence from her hometown. "Your family." She nodded, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "My younger sister, Sarah. She's 17 now." "What does she say?" Patrick asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. Abigail smoothed the letter on her lap. "That my father is ill. His heart. The doctor doesn't think he will recover." She paused, swallowing hard. "She asks if I would come, before it's too late." Patrick absorbed this in silence. He knew how deeply Abigail had been hurt by her family's rejection, particularly her father, who as head of the household had cast the final vote for her banishment. That wound had never fully healed, despite the happiness she had found in her new life. "Do you want to go?" he asked simply. Abigail looked up at him, conflict evident in her expression. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me says I owe him nothing. He turned his back on me when I needed him most. But another part," her voice faltered. "He's still my father, Patrick, and if he's dying—" Patrick took her hands in his. "Then we should go," he said decisively. "All of us, you, me, and James, as a family." Surprise flickered across Abigail's face. "You would come with me? Back to Newton?" "Of course I would." Patrick's tone brooked no argument. "You're my wife. Where you go, I go. Besides," he added with a wry smile, "I'd like to meet the man who raised such a remarkable daughter. Even if he was fool enough to let her go." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "What if they reject me again? Reject us?" "Then we'll come back home knowing you did what you could," Patrick replied. "But they might surprise you, Abigail. People change. Perspectives shift. And you're not the same frightened girl who left Newton. You're a woman now, a wife and mother, strong in your own right." Abigail considered this, then nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed. "I am different now, stronger." "And you have me," Patrick reminded her, squeezing her hands. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The journey to Newton took nearly a week, with stops along the way to rest, particularly for James's benefit. The boy, now just over a year old, proved to be a remarkably good traveler, fascinated by the changing scenery and the motion of the wagon. As they approached the outskirts of Newton, Abigail grew increasingly tense. Patrick could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she clutched James a little tighter on her lap. "We can still turn back," he offered quietly. Abigail shook her head. "No, I need to do this. For myself as much as for him." Newton was much as Abigail had described it, a small but prosperous town with a main street lined with businesses, a white steepled church at one end, and neat houses spreading outward from the center. As they drove down the main street, Patrick noticed people stopping to stare, whispers following in their wake. "News travels fast in small towns," Abigail murmured. "They recognize me." Patrick set his jaw, his protective instincts flaring. "Let them stare," he said. "You've nothing to be ashamed of." They continued to the far end of town, where Abigail directed him to a modest two-story house set back from the road. A small sign beside the door read "Turner's General Store," though the shop appeared to be closed. Before Patrick could help her down from the wagon, the front door opened, and a young woman rushed out, Abigail's sister Sarah, he presumed. She was the image of Abigail but younger, her face unmarked by the experiences that had matured her older sister. "Abigail," she cried, rushing toward the wagon. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." Abigail handed James to Patrick and climbed down, immediately enveloped in her sister's embrace. Patrick watched as the two women clung to each other, years of separation dissolving in tears and half-finished sentences. Finally, Abigail stepped back, turning to introduce Patrick and James. "Sarah, this is my husband, Patrick Callahan, and our son, James." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in Patrick's tall form and the child in his arms. "Your husband?" "But I thought that's a long story," Abigail interrupted gently. "One I'll tell you later. How is father?" Sarah's expression sobered. "Not well. He's been asking for you, though, ever since he received word that you were married and had a child." Abigail frowned. "How did he know about that?" "Martha wrote to your mother last Christmas," Patrick explained quietly. "She thought they should know you were well and settled." Abigail glanced at him in surprise, but before she could respond, an older woman appeared in the doorway of the house. "Abigail," her voice quavered with emotion. "Is it really you?" "Mother," Abigail breathed, and then she was running up the path to embrace the woman whose features mirrored her own, aged by time and hardship. Patrick followed more slowly. James balanced on his hip, allowing Abigail this moment with her family. Sarah fell into step beside him. "Thank you for bringing her," she said quietly. "Father has been tormented by what happened. He needs to make peace before he goes." Patrick nodded, understanding. She needed this too, though she might not have admitted it. Inside the house, Abigail's mother, Margaret Turner, fussed over them, insisting they must be exhausted from their journey and offering refreshments. But Abigail was focused on one thing only. "I'd like to see Father," she said firmly. "If he's asking for me, I don't want to wait." Margaret nodded, her eyes lingering on James with a mixture of wonder and regret. "He's upstairs in your parents' bedroom. The stairs are too much for him now." Abigail turned to Patrick. "Will you come with me?" "Of course," he replied immediately. "If you're sure you want me there, I'm sure." Her voice was steady, her chin lifted in the determined way he had come to know and love. "We're a family. We do this together." With James still in Patrick's arms, they climbed the stairs, following Margaret to a door at the end of the hallway. She knocked softly before entering. "John," she said gently. "She's here. Abigail's here." The man in the bed looked smaller than Patrick had imagined from Abigail's descriptions, diminished by illness, his once robust frame wasted, his face pale against the pillows. But his eyes, when they fixed on Abigail, were sharp with recognition and something like hope. "Abigail," he said, his voice a mere whisper of its former strength. "You came." Abigail moved to the bedside, her steps hesitant but her gaze steady. "Yes, Father, I came." John Turner's eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't sure you would, after what I did." "Sarah said you wanted to see me," Abigail replied, neither accepting nor rejecting his implied apology. "I did, I do." His gaze shifted to Patrick and James, standing just inside the doorway. "Is that?" "My husband, Patrick Callahan," Abigail confirmed. "And our son, James." Something flickered across John's face, surprise perhaps, or confusion. "But I thought, the father." "Patrick is James's father in every way that matters," Abigail said firmly. "He has given us his name, his protection, and his love." Patrick stepped forward then, James still in his arms. "Mr. Turner," he greeted the older man with a respectful nod. John studied him for a long moment, then asked weakly, "You took in my daughter when she was with another man's child." "I married your daughter because she is the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known," Patrick corrected, his tone polite but firm. "James is my son, and I thank God every day that Abigail agreed to be my wife." John seemed taken aback by this response. He looked from Patrick to Abigail, then to James, who was regarding the stranger in the bed with solemn curiosity. "I was wrong," John said finally, the words seeming to cost him great effort. "To send you away, Abigail, I was afraid of what people would think, of the shame." He closed his eyes briefly. "I put my pride above my own child. I can never make that right." Abigail stood silent, tears streaming down her face. Patrick moved to her side, shifting James to one arm so he could place the other around her shoulders. "You can't change what happened," Abigail said at last, "but I'm here now, and I'm willing to listen." John Turner nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "That's more than I deserve," he admitted. Will you let me meet my grandson?" Abigail looked at Patrick, who nodded encouragingly. She took James from his arms and brought him to the bedside. "This is James Patrick Callahan," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Your grandson." John raised a trembling hand to touch James's cheek. The boy regarded him solemnly, then reached out and grabbed the old man's finger in his tiny fist. "He has your eyes," John whispered. "Green like your grandmother's." For the next hour they sat with John, sharing stories of James's birth and first year, of the ranch in Arizona, of the life Abigail and Patrick had built together. As John's strength waned, Margaret insisted they let him rest. "You'll stay, won't you?" she asked anxiously as they left the room. "We've prepared your old room for you, and there's space for the baby." Abigail glanced at Patrick, who nodded his agreement. "Yes, we'll stay," she told her mother. "For a few days at least." That evening, after James was asleep in a hastily arranged cradle, Abigail and Patrick retired to her childhood bedroom. It was strange, Patrick thought, to be in this space that had shaped his wife's early years, the faded floral wallpaper, the small desk where she had studied, the narrow bed barely big enough for the two of them. "It feels so different being here now," Abigail said, echoing his thoughts as she sat on the edge of the bed. "Like it belongs to someone else's life." Patrick sat beside her, taking her hand. "How are you feeling? After seeing your father," she considered this, her expression thoughtful. "Relieved, I think, and sad, and angry still, though not as much as I expected to be." She turned to him. "Is that strange? To feel so many things at once?" "Not at all," Patrick assured her. "He hurt you deeply, Abigail. That wound doesn't heal just because he's ill and sorry now." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but I'm glad we came. For James's sake, if nothing else. He should know his family, even the imperfect parts of it." Patrick drew her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're an extraordinary woman, Abigail Callahan." She smiled at that, leaning into his embrace. "I'm the woman you helped me become," she said softly, "strong enough to face the past without being consumed by it." They stayed in Newton for a week, during which John Turner's health declined steadily. Abigail spent hours at his bedside, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting with him in silence. Patrick gave them the space they needed for this reconciliation, occupying himself with James and getting to know the town that had shaped his wife's early years. On their 5th day in Newton, Patrick encountered Thomas Blackwell. He had taken James for a walk, giving Abigail time alone with her father, when a man approached them on the main street, tall, fair-haired, with an easy charm that set Patrick's teeth on edge even before he introduced himself. "That's a fine-looking boy you have there," the stranger remarked, stopping beside Patrick. "Reminds me of someone." Patrick tightened his hold on James. "Thank you," he replied curtly, making to move on. "Wait," the man said. "You're not from around here, are you? Passing through?" "Visiting family," Patrick answered vaguely. The man studied him, then James, more closely. "You wouldn't happen to be visiting the Turners, would you?" Patrick's instincts flared in warning. "Who's asking?" "Thomas Blackwell," the man said, extending his hand. "I was acquainted with the family some time back." Patrick ignored the offered hand, his expression hardening as he recognized the name. "I know who you are," he said coldly. "You're the man who abandoned Abigail Turner when she needed you most." Blackwell had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It wasn't like that," he protested. "I had business to attend to. I meant to come back." "But you didn't," Patrick pointed out, his voice level despite the anger simmering beneath. "And now it's too late. Abigail is my wife and James is my son." Surprise flickered across Blackwell's face, followed by a calculating look as his gaze returned to James. "Is that so? Well, congratulations, although—" He paused meaningfully. "That boy has my mother's chin, don't you think?" The implication was clear, and it took all of Patrick's self-control not to react as his instincts demanded. Instead, he shifted James to his other arm, putting his body between the boy and Blackwell. "James is my son in every way that matters," he said firmly. The law recognizes it, and more importantly, so do I. Whatever claim you think you might have, you forfeited it when you rode away and left Abigail to face the consequences alone. Blackwell's expression hardened. That's a matter of opinion, and possibly one for a judge to decide. Patrick stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure only Blackwell could hear. Listen carefully. You abandoned Abigail when she was carrying your child. Her own family cast her out. She was alone, frightened, with nowhere to go when I found her. I gave her my name, my protection, and my love. James has known no father but me. He paused, letting the words sink in. If you truly care about that boy in my arms, you'll walk away now and leave us in peace, because I promise you this: I will do whatever it takes to protect my family. The steel in Patrick's tone was unmistakable. Blackwell studied him for a long moment, perhaps weighing his options before finally stepping back. No need for threats, he said, affecting a casual tone that didn't match the wary look in his eyes. I was just curious, is all. If the boy's being well looked after, that's all that matters. He is, Patrick confirmed, better than you could imagine. Blackwell nodded, a tight smile crossing his face. Well then, I wish you and Mrs. Callahan all the best. He tipped his hat and walked away, his posture stiff. Patrick watched him go, his heart hammering in his chest. Only when Blackwell had disappeared into the saloon at the far end of the street did he relax his stance, looking down at James, who had observed the entire exchange with solemn curiosity. Let's go back to your grandparents' house, Patrick said softly, pressing a kiss to the boy's dark hair. Your mother will be wondering where we are. He debated whether to tell Abigail about the encounter. In the end, honesty won out. That evening, after James was asleep, he recounted the meeting with Blackwell, watching her face carefully for her reaction. Abigail paled but remained composed. What do you think he'll do? She asked. Nothing, if he's smart, Patrick replied. He has no legal claim to James. We were married before the birth, and my name is on all the documents. Besides, he added with grim satisfaction, I don't think he's the type to want the responsibility of a child. He was testing the waters, nothing more. Abigail nodded, though worry still creased her brow. I'd like to leave soon, she said. Tomorrow, if possible. Father is. He's failing quickly. The doctor says it could be any time now, but I don't want to be here if Thomas decides to make trouble. Patrick took her hands in his. We'll leave whenever you're ready, he promised. But don't let fear of that man drive you away from your family when they need you. I won't let him come near you or James. Tears filled Abigail's eyes. How did I get so fortunate? She whispered. To find you when I had lost everything else. Patrick gathered her into his arms. I'm the fortunate one, he murmured against her hair. Never doubt that. John Turner passed away peacefully 2 days later with Abigail at his bedside. In his final moments, he had clasped her hand and whispered, Forgive me, to which she had replied through tears, I already have. The funeral was held the following day, a simple service attended by most of the town. Patrick stood beside Abigail, James in his arms, as the coffin was lowered into the earth. He noted the curious glances from the townspeople, the whispers behind hands, but Abigail held her head high, her grief dignified and private. Thomas Blackwell did not appear at the funeral, for which Patrick was grateful. He had no desire for a confrontation, especially not on such a day. Afterward, at the gathering in the Turner home, Patrick found himself speaking with the town minister, Reverend Davis, who had presided over the service. I want to thank you, the Reverend said quietly, for what you've done for Abigail. Her father was deeply troubled by his decision to send her away. It eased his passing to know she was well cared for. I didn't do it for him, Patrick replied honestly. I did it because I saw something special in her, something worth protecting and cherishing. The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as our greatest challenges. He glanced across the room to where Abigail stood with her mother and sister. She seems happy. I hope she is, Patrick said. I try to make her so. And the boy, Reverend Davis asked carefully, he's thriving. James is perfect, Patrick answered without hesitation. Strong, curious, stubborn like his mother, and very loved. The minister seemed satisfied with this. Good. That's what matters in the end, isn't it? Not how families come together, but that they are bound by love. They departed Newton the following day after emotional farewells with Margaret and Sarah. Abigail's mother had pressed a small box into her hands before they left. Your grandmother's jewelry, she explained. Your father always meant for you to have it, and there's a letter. He wrote it before he became too weak. For when you're ready. The journey home to Arizona was quieter than their trip east had been. Abigail was subdued, processing her grief and the complex emotions stirred by the reconciliation with her father. Patrick gave her the space to reflect, keeping James entertained and handling the practicalities of travel. It was only when they crossed into Arizona territory that Abigail seemed to come back to herself, sitting up straighter on the wagon seat as familiar landmarks appeared. It feels good to be coming home, she remarked, the first unprompted comment she'd made in days. Patrick glanced at her, pleased by the observation. It does, he agreed. Though I'm sorry about your father. Abigail nodded, her expression pensive. I'm glad we went, she said after a moment. Not just for his sake, but for mine, and for James. She looked back at their son, napping in the makeshift bed they'd created in the wagon. He'll know that his grandparents loved him, even if his grandfather didn't live to see him grow up. And he'll know your mother and sister, Patrick added. They're welcome to visit us anytime. Would you mind? Abigail asked, surprised. If they came to stay, of course not, Patrick replied sincerely. They're your family, which makes them our family. Abigail smiled, the first real smile he'd seen since her father's death. Thank you, she said softly, leaning against his shoulder. For everything. They arrived home to find the ranch in good order, Miguel and Jim having tended to everything in their absence. As Patrick carried a sleeping James into the house, Abigail moved from room to room, touching familiar objects as if reassuring herself that this life, the one she had built with Patrick, was still real and solid. That night, after putting James to bed in his cradle, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. Abigail had been quiet during supper, and Patrick could sense she had something on her mind. I read my father's letter, she said finally. While you were putting James down, Patrick nodded, waiting for her to continue. He wrote about his regrets, about how pride and fear made him lose what was most precious to him. She paused, swallowing hard. And he wrote about you. Me, Patrick was surprised. What did he say? That he was grateful to you for seeing the worth in me when he had failed to do so. Abigail's voice wavered slightly. That he could die in peace knowing I had found a man who would love and protect me as he should have done. Patrick was moved by the sentiment, but unsure how to respond. Your father made mistakes, he said carefully. But he loved you, Abigail, I believe that. I know he did, she agreed. In his way. She turned to face Patrick directly. The letter made me think about our own family, about what kind of parents we want to be for James and for any other children we might have. The implication in her words caught Patrick's attention. Are you saying? A small smile curved Abigail's lips. I'm not certain yet, she cautioned. It's too early to tell, but I suspect we might be adding to our family sooner than we planned. Joy surged through Patrick. He gathered Abigail into his arms, laughing as he lifted her from the bench and spun her in a circle. Really? He asked when he set her back on her feet. Another baby. Abigail laughed, her cheeks flushed. Maybe, she repeated. I won't know for sure for a few more weeks, but I feel different the way I did with James. Patrick cupped her face in his hands, overwhelmed with love for this woman who had brought such unexpected happiness into his life. I love you, Abigail Callahan, he said fervently, and I will love any and all children we are blessed with, just as I love James. I know you will, she replied, her eyes shining with tears and joy. That's why I fell in love with you, because you see with your heart, not just your eyes. As they stood together under the Arizona stars, Patrick reflected on the strange, winding path that had led them to this moment. 2 years ago, he had been a solitary rancher with little prospect of change. Then he had found a desperate young woman by a creek, and in trying to save her, had ultimately saved himself. Their love story hadn't begun with romance or passion. It had started with compassion, with a simple offer. I'll give you my name. But from those practical beginnings had grown something far more profound, a true partnership, a deep and abiding love, a family bound together not by blood but by choice. And now, with the possibility of another child on the horizon, their family would grow again, their bond strengthening with each passing day. Let's go inside, Abigail suggested, slipping her hand into his. Tomorrow will be a busy day. Patrick nodded, knowing she was right. There would be cattle to tend, meals to prepare, a curious toddler to chase after. The everyday work of building a life together. But as they walked hand in hand into the home they had created, Patrick knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The cowboy and the banished girl, who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. In the years that followed, the Callahan ranch prospered and grew, as did the family that called it home. James was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, born the following spring, and later by 2 more brothers, William and Joseph. The children thrived in the Arizona sunshine, growing strong and confident under the loving guidance of their parents. Abigail never forgot the lessons of her past, the pain of rejection, the strength found in desperation, the unexpected joy of second chances. She taught her children compassion and resilience, instilling in them the understanding that family was defined not by blood, but by love and loyalty. Patrick, for his part, cherished each day with the family he had never expected to have. The nightmares of war that had once plagued him faded with time, replaced by dreams of cattle drives with his sons, of dances with his daughters, of quiet evenings with Abigail by his side. They never told the younger children the truth of James's parentage. As far as they were concerned, as far as anyone who mattered was concerned, James Patrick Callahan was the firstborn son of Patrick and Abigail, the beginning of their family's story. And in every way that truly counted, he was.